morning. It was once said, or at least written, that the greatest word is God. The deepest word is soul. The longest word is eternity. The swiftest word is time. The nearest word is now. The darkest word is sin. The meanest word is hypocrisy. The broadest word is truth. The strongest word is right. The tenderest word is love. The sweetest word is home. And the dearest word is mom. I think we can appreciate the sentiment behind these thoughts. And I think we all greatly appreciate all the wonderful moms that we have here within our midst. And we give thanks to the lives that you live, to your dedication to your homes, to your families, and everything that you mean to those that you show so much love and support to. We appreciate you and we thank you. I understand it's most importantly our opportunity to worship our God, but it's also an opportunity to give honor where honor is due, and we thank you. We appreciate each and every one of you. We love you very dearly. You know, it was once said that a group of people were brought together, and this group of people were actually split off into 3 more groups. And it was going to be a test to determine responses in the situation that these people were put in. Well, the first group of people received what it is that they were to be given. They received this box, and it was a puzzle inside, and the puzzle pieces matched the image that was on the outside of the box. The second group of people, they were given a box that had a bunch of puzzle pieces within the box, but they did not match the image on the box. The third group of people were given a bag that just simply had some random puzzle pieces in it. It wasn't even all the same pieces to a same puzzle. It was just simply a bunch of random pieces thrown in a bag. Now they were told, okay, well, you have X amount of time to produce your puzzle, and let's see how far you can get in this puzzle. Well, you can only imagine that there was at least a little bit of a offset in who was going to be doing well and who was going to be failing miserably at this. And I suppose there was pretty much a decided group that was going to win this challenge. And you can only imagine, as that first group, they have their box, they have the picture, they have the puzzle pieces, and they begin to put these pieces of the puzzle together, and they do so very quickly without any problem, and they're fairly happy about how well they were able to put this puzzle together. They rejoice over this. Well, the second group, when they began to start trying to piece together the puzzle, they soon realized, look, we've been cheated here. We've been dealt an unfair advantage, and this is just not right. And they became angry. They were frustrated. They pushed that box aside and said, we're not doing it. The third group, they looked at everybody else, and at least they had a box. They had a picture. They had puzzle pieces that actually went together. Well, they just tossed their bag aside. They just kind of laughed it off and said, we don't even have a prayer. Well, they went right back to carrying on and conversating and laughing and cutting up and scrolling on their phones and just kind of removed themselves from what was even going on. Well, I want you to consider that the mother and the father are supposed to be a picture of God. The mom and the dad within the home are supposed to be the image of God. Not a perfect picture, of course, because there was only one who was perfect, but nonetheless we are to be a likeness or at least a representation of what a godly life looks like. That's the image that we are to provide for our children. And I want you to consider those scenarios if they were played out in life, and you consider the children that would look at their parents and they would see the way in which they live their lives, and of course the manner in which they live their lives, it matches the things that they are taught. The puzzle pieces match the image. And of course for those children, they already have a decided advantage because it's going to be much easier for them. They're going to be able to put this life together and pursue holiness. Well, you take that second group, and these children, they see how mom and dad are teaching them one thing, but the image that mom and dad provide, it's far different from the image on the box. And they notice the hypocrisy, and they become angry. Well, why do you expect me to live a certain way if you yourself are not willing to live that same life? This is not right. They become angry. They storm off. And they live whatever life that they see fit. Well, take the third group. Mom and dad are not at all focused upon providing this image of God. They're not even really giving them any kind of instruction that would lead them in the pursuit of godliness, and they just go on about whatever worldly pursuits might come their way. Caught up in the flow of life without any determined purpose that points them toward God. You see, we as the parents, the moms, the dads, the grandparents, we have a great and wonderful responsibility to provide for our children and for our grandchildren this image that they can follow, not simply through the verbal instruction, but also through the lives that we live, something they can look up to and recognize how it aligns with the things that we teach. I want you to turn in your Bible, if you will, to John chapter 14. John chapter 14. Before we go to our text that's going to be under consideration, I want you to look at something in John chapter 14. Now, you're probably familiar with John chapter 14, especially verses 1 through 6. Jesus speaking to his disciples, and he's telling them that he's going to prepare a place for them, and if he goes to prepare a place for them, he's going to come back in like manner to receive them. And he tells them, he is the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody gets to the Father except through me. But if you pick up in verse 7, he says this, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him. Now watch the question that Philip poses. Watch what he says. Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. And I suppose it's a fair request. If you're going to leave us, at least show us the Father. Give us this image. Show us what he looks like. Well, look at Jesus' response. Verse 9. Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me. You see what the request was? We want an image. We want to see what he looks like. And what does Jesus say? You've seen him. You've heard the teachings. You've seen the way that I live my life. And if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And I want us to just think very simply about our own lives. And think about our own homes and our children. What image do they see? What are they pursuing most in life based upon what they see us pursue most in life? I want us, with the time that we have, to consider a brief moment of the life of Hannah, found in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And I want us to consider how Hannah portrays the image of a godly mother. Now, of course, we understand that much application here will be directly focused toward mothers, but of course, think about this, fathers, you're not off the hook. You can very easily think about the things that she is going to do, the way in which she's going to conduct herself through a very difficult situation, and we could apply it to ourselves just the same. I want us to consider how Hannah portrays the image of a soon-to-be godly mother. We're going to go ahead and read 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 18. It's a little lengthy, but I want us to have an understanding of the whole situation. Begin in verse 1 there in 1 Samuel. It says, Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zophim, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah. Now Elkanah is going to be the husband of Hannah. If you drop down to verse 2, it says, And he, that is Elkanah, had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now we're introduced to the problem that Hannah faces. She's not able to bear children. Keep in mind within this context and thinking about the Jewish people, for the mother or the wife not to be able to produce a male heir for her husband, it was a great disgrace. This was a major role and part of her responsibility for her husband and for the family to be able to produce children. Well, the Bible continues to tell us, if you look at verse 4, it says, "And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb." Now, we're at least also told in verse 3, it says, "This man went up from the city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh." They had a godly focus. She also will show to have a godly focus, but I want you to see two names mentioned in verse 3 we'll come back to later. It says also the two sons of Eli. Now Eli is the priest. It says Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. All right, so these two names will come back up again. Well, look at verse 6. It says, "And her rival also provoked her." That is, this other wife provoked Hannah. It says to make her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved?" Now, somewhat a foot in mouth type moment. Elkanah says, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" And of course, we'll come back and have something to say about that. So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she, that is Hannah, was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to the Lord, and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head." And it happened, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli, that is the priest, he watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put away your wine away from you." But Hannah answered and said, "No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." Then Eli said, or answered and said, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Now I think we can understand the situation. I'm sure we could somewhat sympathize with her weakness and her struggle to only imagine to be in a household and that one primary responsibility and duty you're not able to fulfill. And not only that you deal with that and the anguish and the pain from that, but you also have this other woman in the house who is going to continually pick and prod and humiliate and rub it in your face. We can understand the hurt. I think we can at least sympathize with what she's going through somewhat. But when we think about her and consider if we were thinking about some puzzle pieces that we could take and begin to place together to see what a godly mother looks like, there's 3 things we could take from this text. One is this, a godly faith. You see, Hannah deeply trusted in God. You see a godly faith in Hannah. She trusted in God even through something of what most people might call a completely impossible circumstance. Something that most would say you have a problem that you're never going to overcome. There's no way that you will ever bear children if you have not yet. And yet Hannah, being in the situation much like that of Abraham and Sarah, You recall Abraham and Sarah, they would find themselves in a similar situation, and Abraham would request from God to be able to have a son, and God would say, you will have a son, and yet they were impatient, yet they did not wait, and they tried to take matters into their own hands. What we see in regard to this prayer from Hannah, she simply offers up this prayer and she's satisfied. She leaves in peace. Completely dependent upon God, relying on the fact that God would answer and she would be satisfied with whatever the answer would be. A deep trust and faith in God. She knew that there was only one that could deliver her from her suffering and her heartache. And what you see in verses 10 and 11, Hannah laid herself bare before the Lord in prayer. You know, I can't help but to think about the psalm, and the psalmist talking about that idea of search me, know my heart, try me, know my anxieties, see if there's any wicked way in me. And we often talk about that in the sense of how he is laying himself bare, he's being completely transparent. Hannah's doing the same thing. Within this prayer, it involved humility. A complete dependence and trust upon God. Within this prayer, it involves submission. Hannah says, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservants, submitting to God. Within this prayer, it involved emotion. You think about the internal description of emotion that is provided within this text. It says she was in bitterness of soul. Down to the deepest parts of her being, she was bitter because of the hardships she faced. You also look at the external description of her emotion. It says she wept in anguish. It was a prayer that involved sacrifice. If granted a child, she said, I will give him to the Lord all the days of her life, or his life. And I want you to notice that following her prayer and receiving a blessing from Eli, she went in peace. Eli, there in verse 17, it says, go in peace. And the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked him. You look at verse 18 and it says, so the woman went her way and she ate. This problem with no longer being able to eat was resolved. This great weeping and bitterness, it says she was no longer sad. I want you to think about your prayers. And I want you to think about your requests you make to God, and thinking about this, that God can answer that prayer in whatever way he sees fit, that it aligns with his will, and maybe the answer is no. Would you be satisfied and still go in peace? You see, she had a deep trust in God, and there's a couple of things we can take away from that. One is this, her ability to give her burdens over completely to God, to hand them over, allow him to bear those burdens, to release them to him. Now, I suppose if we're being honest with ourselves, in thinking about a situation where, let's say the emotions are high, let's say the circumstances are overwhelming, there's a number of ways in which we might want to respond. One could be this: if we were in Hannah's shoes, we might say, God, why have you done this to me? Why have you made me this way? Why couldn't I be whole? Why can I not be complete? Could be angry with God. I suppose another reaction could be this, that Hannah could have poured out her emotion and her frustration and her anger toward her rival, toward her husband, and let everybody that was close hear about how angry she was. Or we, like Hannah, could pour our hearts out to God, bearing emotion, bearing feelings, and all of our burdens, giving them to him. You see, I'm reminded of 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. It says to cast all your cares upon him. Why? Because he cares for you. He wants to hear about your day. He wants to hear about your struggles. He wants you to cast his cares upon him. You think about Jesus, even as he would approach what would be the darkest hour of his life. And how did he prepare himself? Do you remember what he was doing in the garden? And do you remember the emotion that was expressed through this prayer? Do you remember how he laid himself out bare before God and poured his heart out and says, look, I don't want to have to do this, but I am willing to do your will, God. You notice who failed to pray? The disciples failed to pray. And if you notice on that day, the darkest hour, Jesus was able to go through it and maintain his emotions and his responses without problem. And who allowed their emotions to get the better of them? The disciples. You see, I think sometimes when our emotions are heightened and our situations are less than favorable, maybe it's too often that we have so much to say to everyone else who is around us, but too little to say to God. And we forget to cast our cares and our burdens upon Him. Hannah was able to give that burden to God. She completely trusted in Him. She took her problems to God. You think about Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 through 16, and the Bible says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses." We know that part, but it also says, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we might obtain mercy and find grace in time of help, in time of need." She trusted in God. She poured her heart out to God, and she gave her burdens to God. We see a godly faith in Hannah. You know, James would say this in James chapter 1 and verse 6, "But let him who asks, ask in faith without doubting." We can't go to God and say, "God, I want you to help me with this. God, I want to pour my heart out. God, I want to give you this burden." And yet in the back of our mind think, "I don't know that God can handle this." Complete trust. Deep faith in God. That's one piece of the puzzle. What about this? I think we could also easily see a godly character. A godly character. That is, Hannah displayed a gentle and godly spirit through every interaction that we find within these 18 verses. And again, I would remind you that we're talking about a time frame in which her emotions were heightened, she was devastated, she was hurt, and she was being made fun of because of her pain. And yet her interactions were godly. You know, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 4, it says, "The incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of our God." And I understand the context. In part, that's talking about the way in which a woman will adorn herself, and talking about the way that she will clothe herself, and talking about that inward beauty, but it points even still to that gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. I'm reminded when I think about interactions and how I might respond if I was in her shoes. And I think about Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. It says, "If at all possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Now think about those verses and consider the interactions that we find that Hannah had to deal with. Look at verses 6 and 7. Hannah endured provocation without becoming hateful. She endured provocation without becoming hateful. Peninnah, her rival, verse 6, also provoked her severely with a very specific reason, to make her miserable. Now, this was not an occasional irritation. This was a continual emotional cruelty. A year by year that they went up to the house of the Lord, and she provoked her, verse 7. Peninnah purposefully targeted Hannah's deepest pain, her deepest insecurity. She attacked her in that way. Yet nowhere in the text do you find retaliation. Nowhere in the text do you find revenge. Do you find bitterness? Yes, it said she was bitter of soul. An inward bitterness, a struggle because of this problem she faced, but it wasn't bitterness toward her rival. You do not see harsh speech. You do not see hate speech. As a matter of fact, you just see silence. And I suppose sometimes maybe the most powerful lesson we can provide is simply being silent. We talked about this past Wednesday in Bible class, but thinking about Jesus in his interaction with Pilate, Pilate continued to question Jesus. He continued to say to him, "Don't you know I have the authority to take your life or to give you life?" And Jesus says simply this, "You would have no authority at all if it wasn't given to you by my Father." And from that point forward, it seems as if at least Pilate's mind was changed about who this Jesus is, and I don't believe he really wanted to see him go to the cross. Silence is powerful. You look at verse 8. Look at verse 8. Hannah responded graciously even when misunderstood. She responded graciously even when misunderstood. Elkanah, that is her husband, his response, I do know for a fact that Elkanah loved her. I mean, if you look back at verse 5 there in chapter 1, it says, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah. Hannah seemed to be lovable. He loved her dearly, and I'm sure he tried to provide for her and to be there for her, but what he said, I suppose, is a little bit insensitive. It's one of those moments, if you were there and you witnessed him say, am I not better than 10 sons? You might have had the thought, what did you just say? Bless him. Right? Maybe that's all we can say, bless him. Bless his heart. Foot in mouth, fully inserted. And I suppose Hannah probably had all kinds of things that might have went through her mind, but simply because he had an imperfect response to her situation didn't mean he was deserving of a hateful or angry response. And you see, Hannah was able to simply stay silent, even though her husband did not fully understand the depth of her grief and inserted his foot wholeheartedly into his mouth. You look at how Hannah answered a false accusation with humility and respect when you look at verses 12 through 16. Right, Eli, this priest, he wrongly accuses her of being what we might call babbling drunk. In one of the most emotionally painful moments of her life. And yet notice her response. No, my Lord. Respect in the way that she communicates with him. And I suppose if you were to consider, remember we mentioned these two sons of Eli that are seen there in verse 3. But if you look in chapter 2, and look at verse 12, and it says, now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 22, it says, now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all of Israel, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Do you know Hannah could have simply said this? Listen here, you old goat, what are you talking about? You think you got me figured out? You can't even get your own house under control. Why are you coming at me like that? No, my Lord. Simply respectful. Gentle. Honest. And controlled. She defended herself without dishonoring Eli. And I suppose that's a spiritual maturity that is very rare in the life of many Christians. A little application we can take away from this. You know, we have Hannah's interaction with God. We have her interaction with her rival, with her husband, and with a priest. While highly emotional and hurt, yet she seems to behave godly. Could you imagine if all the children in the world today could have this image at home? To see this kind of godliness and this kind of character within their own parents and the impact that would have on the world. You see, children remember reactions. Children remember tone. They remember responses. They remember attitudes. They remember how their parents conduct themselves under pressure. They watch how mom and dad handle stress. They watch how mom and dad respond to unfairness. They watch how mom and dad speak when they are misunderstood. And I suppose if the image is well enough for mom and dad, then wouldn't it be well enough for the children? There was a father who received a phone call from the school. His son is in middle school, and he receives a call, and it is the principal saying, hey, you're going to have to come get your son. He's just been disciplined for this outburst of wrath and his behavior and his foul language, and you need to come get him. He's going to be expelled for about 3 days. Well, the husband quickly calls the mother and says, look, I don't have time for this. I'm too busy. I need you to go pick him up. And the mother goes to the school, and she goes to the principal's office, and there their son is. And the principal begins to tell her what happened. Well, they were in their science class and they had their stations set up and they were working through this activity and they were putting all these pieces together on this little panel. And if you get everything done right, you flip the switch and the light comes on. And of course, there would be rejoicing in being able to accomplish this and it working and functioning properly. Well, everybody in the class flipped the switch and the lights come on except this little boy. And he took that project and he threw it in the floor. He stood up off his stool and he kicked it across the room and he let out all kinds of words that should have never even been in his mouth. And as this principal is telling this mother, she's beside herself. She's devastated, thinking, how on earth could you ever do something like this? Humiliated. And get out to the car, and of course she tells the boy, your father said, you wait till he gets home. There's discipline to come. And she asked him, she said, where on earth or why on earth would you ever behave like this? And the boy said, Daddy does it all the time. And nobody ever says anything to him. You see, they're watching. They're looking to the image that we provide, and it's either godly or it's worldly. Very quickly, and I'll just skim the thoughts of this third piece of the puzzle. She had a godly vision. Not in the sense of a vision like, okay, she had this moment where she was in a trance and she saw some sort of dream. She had vision, that is, she had direction, she had purpose, she knew where she was going in life, and she knew where she wanted her son to be, to go in life. She had a godly vision. Hannah was heavenly focused. And I want you to think about it. We'll simply think about in regard to her son and her being willing to say, listen, if you will give me a child, if you will give me one son, I will give him to you all the days of his life. What a greater purpose than mom and dad to make sure that their children are focused on living their lives for God. And I'm reminded, even if you look at the Psalm 127, Psalm 127 verses 3 through 5. Psalm 127 verses 3 through 5, it says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, a great blessing, a gift from God. The fruit of the womb is a reward. To be able to experience parenthood, to have children, this is a reward from God. Verse 4, it says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are children in one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. I suppose we might at least want to ask the question, if we have some of those arrows in our quiver, we know that arrows are meant to be aimed. They're meant to be launched in a direction. Where are we aiming them? Where's their trajectory? You know, there was a war that was fought many, many years ago in the 1400s, the Battle of Agincourt. And you had an exhausted underdog English army who actually was able to defeat a superior French army. And it's said that this victory was won by the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow against these armored knights. And apparently these English archers were so well trained, so well practiced, with such vision. They claimed that if a knight was to raise his helmet anywhere from 350 yards out and closer, these archers could hit their mark. They were precise. They were focused. They were accurate. And they took what was going to be a great upset, an underdog who never stood a chance to win this battle, and yet they won due to the precision of the flight of these arrows. And I come back and I think about my home, and I think about these arrows that God has blessed me with. And I think about the direction and the precision and the focus and the determination and the great responsibility that I have to give them everything that they need to be able to pursue godliness. And one of those pieces of the puzzle, I have to look back at myself and say, what image am I portraying? Who do they see? if I'm teaching them one thing and I'm living a completely different life, they're going to become angry. They're going to become frustrated. I mean, Jesus spoke of the Pharisees saying, yeah, you can listen to the things that they say. You can do those things, but don't do the things that they do. The blind leading the blind, both will fall into the ditch. They go all around the world trying to find a proselyte, make him twice as much a son of hell as he was before. Don't follow their ways. If our children, if we're teaching them one thing and they see something else, they're going to become frustrated. And they're going to storm off and go about this life however they want to. If we're not willing to put forth the effort on our part to pursue godliness, to do everything that we can to teach them about godliness, we've already given them a decided unfair circumstance. And they're going to go right out into the world. But if we're willing to live our lives in a godly manner, searching to know God, drawing closer to God, and we teach our children and we show them these things, guess what? They have their best chance to making it to heaven. Where are you aiming the arrows? I hope we're aiming them at heaven, and we're going to do anything possible to make sure that they don't miss their mark. Brother Adam Orr had mentioned this when he was here for the gospel meeting. He said, they're ours for a little while, so that they can be God's for eternity. Moms and dads, both alike. What image do you show your children? What are you teaching them? Maybe there are certain parts about the image that you're portraying that's becoming somewhat skewed, and it no longer aligns with what you really want them to be in life. You can make changes. As a matter of fact, it doesn't matter what that image looked like yesterday. You can begin to change the image today. You have that choice, so long as you still have breath in your lungs. Each and every one of us, on a daily basis, need to be willing to be honest with ourselves, to be honest with our leadership, with our guidance, with our parenting, with our children. Be willing to make the proper changes so that you can give them their best chance in making it home to the Father. Maybe you have some things in your life this morning that are amiss and you need the prayers of the congregation. Maybe you realize that you have not done the best, whether it be in parenting or whether it be in your role as a husband or your role as a wife. Maybe it's the case that you've just simply not began that walk, became a Christian, being baptized for the remission of your sins, obeying the gospel, and beginning that path in that direction, that pursuit of holiness. Whatever the case, I hope you know that you have brethren here that want to pray for you, to encourage you and help you every step of the way. If you have need this morning, please let it be known as together we stand and we sing.